The day my husband's life changed forever began like any other quiet morning in early spring, the kind that smells faintly of wet grass and distant rain. The sun was just beginning to push through the curtains, casting soft golden slivers across our small kitchen table, where the newspaper lay open to an article he would never finish reading. I remember how his hand trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee mug, a tremor I brushed off as fatigue, as nothing more than the residue of another sleepless night. We had been tired for months, both of us. Tired from bills, from aging, from the subtle invisible erosion that life brings when you stop paying attention. But within seconds, everything quiet and ordinary about that morning shattered. The mug slipped from his hand, coffee splashing across the tiles, and then he fell, soundless, like a tree collapsing in a storm. I didn't understand what was happening, not until I saw the twisted shape of his mouth, the way his eyes darted wildly, trapped inside a body that would no longer obey him. The paramedics came fast, their voices a blur, the smell of antiseptic and fear filling the air as I followed their commands without thinking. Stroke, they said. The word felt heavy, final, like a sentence being handed down. At the hospital, the hallways were cold and humming with machines, and I sat there, still wearing my slippers, staring at the red emergency light over the door that hid him from me. Hours passed. When they finally let me see him, he looked so small, so pale, half his face still and unresponsive, his right arm limp against the sheet. A doctor explained that his chances of full recovery were slim, that it would be a long road. But I didn't hear slim, I heard possible. And that single word became my anchor. I promised myself, and him, that I would never give up. The first year was a blur of rehab centers, hospital visits, and sleepless nights. I learned to feed him, bathe him, help him relearn how to speak. I celebrated every tiny victory as if it were a miracle. The first time he moved his fingers again. The first slurred word that sounded like home. Our house transformed into a small care facility, filled with pill organizers, mobility aids, and the constant hum of the oxygen machine. Friends visited at first, bringing casseroles and soft smiles, but soon the visits became less frequent. Pity wears people out. I understood that, even if it hurt. So it became just him and me, orbiting each other in this small world built from devotion and necessity. 5 years passed like that. Slow, repetitive, and sacred in its own strange way. He couldn't walk without help, his speech was limited, and his once sharp mind now drifted in and out of clarity like a flickering light. Some days he would call me by my name, others he'd stare blankly as if I were a nurse instead of his wife. Still, I loved him through every second. I told myself that love was the act of staying, even when the person you're staying for no longer fully exists. Every morning I rose before dawn to prepare his breakfast, check his medication, and massage his hands to keep the stiffness at bay. Every night I whispered prayers into the quiet, asking God to give me strength, to let me be enough. But love, even the purest kind, doesn't erase exhaustion. There were nights when I sat in the dark, hands trembling, wondering how much longer I could go on. The smell of antiseptic clung to my clothes. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound of his breathing machine. Sometimes I'd look at the wedding photo on our dresser, the one where he stood tall and smiling, and I'd feel a sharp, confusing mixture of grief and anger. I missed him, the old him, the man who teased me about my burnt toast, who danced with me barefoot in the kitchen. Now, when I looked into his eyes, I saw the ghost of that man, and I wondered if he still saw me too. One winter evening, after a particularly difficult week of seizures and medication changes, I sat beside his bed reading aloud. The room was dim except for the yellow light from the lamp, and his breathing was slow, rhythmic. Then I noticed something new, a faint smell, like metal and ammonia, coming from the feeding tube site. My stomach tightened. I cleaned it carefully, changed the dressing, and told myself it was nothing. But deep down, a whisper of unease had started to grow. Over the next few days, his color changed. Not dramatically, just subtly. His skin looked a little more sallow, his eyes a little duller. He was quieter too, his few words slurred with fatigue. I mentioned it to the visiting nurse, a kind woman named Lila who came twice a week to check his vitals and review his charts. She listened, nodded, and told me she'd run some routine blood work, just in case. That's when everything began to shift. 2 days later, Lila arrived earlier than usual. She was quiet that morning, more serious than I'd ever seen her. She checked his pulse, his oxygen levels, then looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes softened, but her voice dropped low, almost to a whisper. "You should check his labs," she said. That was all. No explanation, no details. Just those 4 words. Check his labs. Something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. When I asked what she meant, she shook her head slightly, her professional mask returning. "Just call the doctor," she said, "and make sure you get the results yourself." Then she left. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of silence after the door closed. My heart pounded as I turned toward him, still sleeping peacefully in the bed. What could possibly be in those labs that she couldn't tell me outright? I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself she was just being cautious. But the whisper stuck to my mind like a seed, and that night, long after the house had gone still, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at the patient portal. The results weren't yet posted, so I waited, 1 hour, then 2, my fingers tracing circles on the wood as the old clock ticked relentlessly. When they finally appeared, I clicked through, not really knowing what I was looking for. At first, nothing made sense. Rows of numbers, acronyms, reference ranges. But one result caught my eye. Liver enzymes, drastically elevated. Another, abnormal kidney function. My pulse quickened. Then came the final line, toxicology, positive for something called Valproate. I frowned, confused. That wasn't one of his prescribed medications. I double-checked his pill bottles, every label, every dosage, and nowhere was that drug listed. I felt my throat close, my breath turning shallow. Someone had been giving him something that shouldn't have been there. But who? And why? Before I could call the doctor, I felt the walls of the room press inward, my vision blurring as if reality itself had tilted. For 5 years, I had trusted every nurse, every home care assistant, every doctor. I had let strangers into my home, my husband's veins, his body. The idea that one of them could have hurt him, slowly, quietly, was unthinkable. And yet, that whisper, that strange urgency in Lila's voice, echoed through me like a warning bell. I called her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice shaking. "Lila, it's me. I saw the labs. What's happening?" Sleep didn't come that night. I sat by his bed, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, wondering if the man I had cared for so completely had been poisoned right under my nose. My mind spiraled through memories. Every fainting spell, every sudden fever, every unexplained confusion. Had I missed the signs? Had I trusted too easily? The clock struck 3 in the morning when I finally realized something chilling. The last time I'd refilled his prescriptions, the pharmacy label had looked slightly different. I'd thought nothing of it. But now, in the dark, it felt like a puzzle piece I had ignored. The next morning, I drove to the pharmacy with the pill bottle clutched in my hand. The pharmacist, a young man with tired eyes, scanned the barcode, then frowned. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this medication isn't in our system. Are you sure this came from us?" My stomach dropped. He turned the bottle in his hands, examining the label. "This isn't one of ours," he said finally. "And this isn't even the manufacturer we use." My world tilted again. I left the pharmacy in a daze, the bottle still warm from his hands. When I returned home, Lila's car was parked out front. She stood on the porch, her expression tense. I could tell she had been waiting. Before I could speak, she took my hands and looked me straight in the eye. "You need to call the doctor now," she said softly. "And maybe the police." Her words hit me like cold water. I wanted to ask everything, how she knew, what she suspected. But the way her eyes flicked toward the window, toward my husband inside, told me enough. Something was terribly wrong, and she was afraid. My body moved on instinct then. I called the doctor, my voice barely steady, explained what had happened, and he told me to bring him in immediately. But before we left, I glanced back at Lila. She gave a small nod. Encouragement or warning, I couldn't tell. The drive to the hospital was slow and tense. He dozed in the passenger seat, his hand cold in mine, unaware of the storm building around us. When we arrived, the staff moved quickly, drawing more blood, ordering scans, whispering among themselves in tight, hushed tones. I sat in the waiting room for hours, every sound amplified. The rustle of magazines, the beep of machines, the distant cry of someone down the hall. My heart hammered against my ribs as the door finally opened and the doctor stepped out, his face pale. "Mrs. Andrews," he began, hesitating. "I need to ask, who's been administering his medication at home?" I froze. "I have," I said slowly. "Why?" He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Because his blood work shows he's been receiving repeated doses of a drug that was never prescribed. It's been building up for months. Whoever gave it to him could have severely compromised his organs." The words cut through me like ice. My hands began to shake, and I felt the world spin again. "But I wouldn't." He raised a hand gently. "I'm not saying you did, Mrs. Andrews, but someone did." And that's when everything I thought I knew about love, care, trust, began to crumble. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the sterile floor tiles. My mind replayed every nurse, every shift change, every small interaction I had overlooked. There had been others before Lila, replacements, temporary aides who came and went. Could one of them have done this? And for what reason? When I returned to his room, Lila was there again, standing quietly beside his bed. Her eyes met mine, filled with both sorrow and relief. "You found out," she said softly. I nodded, my voice caught somewhere between rage and heartbreak. Before I continue with what happened next, the revelation that would change everything I believed about the last 5 years of my life, tell me in the comments below, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you trust the whisper of a stranger, or would you doubt your own instincts after so much time living in the shadow of love and loss? Because sometimes, the truth doesn't knock, it whispers. If you're still with me in this story, and if your heart is already pounding like mine was that night, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what came next. When the doctor's words finally sank in, it felt as though the entire hospital tilted slightly under my feet, like the world had been pulled off balance. I remember gripping the armrest of the waiting chair so tightly that my knuckles went white, the leather biting into my palm. Someone had been giving my husband an unprescribed drug, slowly, deliberately, and it had been happening right under my nose, in my own home. My mind spun through faces like cards shuffled in a deck. The caregivers, the rotating nurses, the pharmacy staff, even the delivery drivers who dropped off medical supplies. But every thought kept circling back to one question: why? Why would anyone want to harm a man who could barely speak, barely move, whose existence was confined to the quiet rhythms of our small house? Lila stayed close that day, shadowing every test, every doctor's visit, her usually calm demeanor replaced by a strange, quiet urgency. At one point, as we stood outside the lab doors, I asked her outright if she knew something, if this was more than just a medical mystery. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone might hear. Then, in a whisper, she said, "Just keep everything documented. Every bottle, every note, every person who's been in your house. Don't throw anything away." Her tone sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't advice, it was a warning. When we returned home that evening, the air inside felt heavy, almost watchful. The house that had once been a haven now felt like a crime scene. Every object carried a strange weight. The pill organizer on the counter, the rows of medication bottles, the syringes neatly lined up in a drawer. I sat at the kitchen table, the glow from the ceiling light washing everything in a sterile yellow, and began sorting through the bottles one by one. My hands moved automatically, but my thoughts raced. Some of the labels were slightly faded, others smudged. One in particular, a bottle labeled sodium chloride flushes, looked newer than the rest. The cap still gleamed, untouched by the fingerprints of routine use. Something about it felt wrong. I unscrewed the lid and sniffed. It didn't smell like saline. It smelled faintly of chemicals, sharp and bitter. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the recliner beside his bed, listening to the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine. His breathing was shallow, labored, as though even the act of drawing air had become a battle. I thought about the years that had passed. 5 long years of devotion, fear, and repetition. I had built my entire existence around him, around keeping him alive. Every morning I had woken with purpose, every action driven by love. But now, love felt tangled with doubt. Had my care been enough, or had it blinded me to the danger standing right in front of me? The next morning, I began calling agencies, the home health company, the pharmacy, even the hospital. I asked for records, logs, supply deliveries, anything that could show who had come into contact with his medication. Most gave me polite, bureaucratic responses, promising to email forms within the next few business days. But one call, to the home health company, made my blood run cold. The woman on the line sounded surprised when I asked about a nurse named Lila. "Lila?" she repeated, typing. "I don't see anyone by that name currently assigned to your case." I blinked, confused. "No, she's been visiting for months," I said. "She comes twice a week. You have to have her listed." More typing. Then a pause. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said carefully. "We haven't had a nurse named Lila employed here in over a year." The silence that followed was deafening. I hung up slowly, my hand trembling. For a long time, I just sat there staring at the phone, my mind refusing to accept what I'd just heard. If she didn't work for the agency, then who was she? Who had I been letting into my house, into my husband's care, into our lives? The next hours blurred into chaos. I called the hospital, explained everything to the doctor, and within minutes he urged me to contact the police. I didn't want to believe it had come to that. The idea of turning this tragedy, our quiet, exhausted life, into an investigation felt unbearable. But the truth had already begun to crack open, and there was no sealing it again. The police came that afternoon, 2 officers with calm, measured voices and notebooks. They filled with neat handwriting while my hands shook uncontrollably. They collected the medications, took photographs, and promised to send the suspicious bottles for analysis. That night, as they left, one of the officers looked at me with a kind of sympathy that cut deeper than any words. "You did the right thing," he said softly. "Whatever happens, remember that." But there was no comfort in that. Not yet. Over the next few days, the investigation unfolded in slow, deliberate layers. Detectives visited, asking the same questions over and over, comparing my statements, timing each visit logged by caregivers. They looked through financial records, pharmacy receipts, medical orders. Meanwhile, my husband lay in the hospital, his condition teetering between fragile stability and decline. His skin had taken on that translucent hue of people who have spent too much time in bed, and his eyes fluttered restlessly, as if trapped in some dream he couldn't escape. Every time I touched his hand, I wondered if he knew what was happening. If, in some corner of his consciousness, he understood that everything we had endured together was unraveling into suspicion and betrayal. 3 days later, the phone rang. It was one of the detectives. His tone was grave, but steady. The tests had come back. The chemical found in one of the bottles was indeed valproate, the same substance that had appeared in his lab results. But what chilled me most wasn't the confirmation. It was the source. The batch number printed on the fake label traced back to a supplier who had no record of distributing to private homes. In other words, the medication had been tampered with. The detective's next words hit harder than I expected. "We believe someone was deliberately administering the substance," he said. "Not in high doses. Small ones. Over time. Enough to cause gradual organ failure." I felt the blood drain from my face. "But who would—" He hesitated. "Do you remember anyone new entering your home around the time your husband's health began to decline more noticeably?" Immediately, my mind went to her, Lila, the woman with the calm smile and kind eyes. The one who whispered, "Check his labs." But that made no sense. Why would she warn me if she were guilty? Unless, and the thought made my stomach twist, she had only realized what was happening after it had already begun. Maybe she had stumbled onto something and tried, in her own quiet way, to help. I told the detective everything about the whisper, the missing employment record, the sudden disappearance. He listened carefully, taking notes, and promised to look into it. But as the days turned into weeks, no one could find her. No address, No last name that matched any database. It was as if she had simply vanished. During that time, I barely left the hospital. I lived between the steady pulse of the monitors and the hum of the fluorescent lights, existing on vending machine coffee and restless worry. Every time a nurse walked in, I watched her movements carefully, memorizing her face, her gestures, her tone. Trust had become impossible. I had built my life around caring, around faith in the goodness of others, and now every smile felt like a mask. One afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the winter light fade into dull gray, an older nurse approached me. Her name tag read Evelyn, and her face was kind, deeply lined, with eyes that seemed to see through pretenses. She handed me a blanket and said softly, "You remind me of myself 20 years ago." I looked up, startled, and she smiled faintly. "I cared for my husband too, till the end. It takes a certain kind of strength, and it can destroy you if you're not careful." Her words hit something raw in me. For so long I had defined myself by sacrifice. Every decision I made, every breath, had been tied to his survival. I had become both nurse and wife, caregiver and prisoner. But now, sitting there in that sterile room, surrounded by machines that hummed and blinked like artificial hearts, I realized how much of myself I had lost. I had given everything, and yet, even that hadn't been enough to protect him. The next morning brought a new development. The detective called again, his tone urgent this time. They had found something, a set of fingerprints on one of the tampered bottles that matched a former nurse who had been fired 2 years ago from a different home care agency for falsifying medication records. Her name was Delia Hart. When he said the name, something clicked in my memory. I remembered the way she had pronounced my husband's name during her first visit, with a slight drawl that didn't match her paperwork. And suddenly, I remembered something else. A moment months ago, when she'd arrived early for a shift, claiming the schedule had changed. I had been too exhausted to question it. The detective explained that they were now pursuing her as a suspect, that an arrest warrant was being prepared. He also told me something that made my hands tremble as I held the phone. Delia had been involved in other cases, quiet ones, buried in bureaucracy, where elderly or disabled patients had suffered unexplained complications. No one had ever proven anything, until now. When I hung up, I stared at my reflection in the hospital window. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and slow, blanketing everything in white. Inside, my husband stirred faintly in his bed, his breathing shallow but steady. For the first time in months, a strange calm settled over me. The truth, as horrifying as it was finally surfacing. Later that night, when I returned home alone, I found a single envelope on my doorstep. My name was written on it in neat, looping handwriting. Inside was a short note, written in ink that had smudged slightly from the cold. It said only this: "You were right to check the labs. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. L." My heart clenched. Lila. She had known. She had tried to warn me, maybe even to protect him from within, until the danger grew too great. I would never know for sure. But in that moment, as tears blurred my vision, I realized that not all ghosts disappear into darkness. Some linger just long enough to point you toward the light. And as I stood there, holding that letter, the world that had been so heavy for so long suddenly felt lighter, if only slightly. The truth was painful, but it was also freeing. The years of confusion, exhaustion, and fear had not been in vain. The whisper that had haunted me now echoed like a lifeline. Before I take you into the final heart-pounding chapter of this story, before I tell you what happened when justice finally came, and what I discovered about my husband's will to survive, tell me in the comments below, have you ever ignored your instincts, only to realize later that they were trying to save you? And if this story has you holding your breath like I did when I found that letter, make sure to subscribe, because what came next changed everything I thought I knew about love, forgiveness, and the strength it takes to let go. When I woke the next morning, the letter from Lila still lay on the kitchen table. Its words burned into my memory like an echo I couldn't silence. You were right to check the labs. I turned those words over in my mind as if they contained a code, a secret message meant to guide me through the chaos that had become my life. The snow outside had stopped, leaving the world covered in a soft white silence. But inside me, a different kind of storm raged, one made of grief, rage, and a strange, unfamiliar clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting, I was awake. The detective called early that morning. His tone was calm but tense, the kind of voice people use when they're holding back something heavy. "We located Delia Hart," he said. "She was found outside the city in a rented apartment under a different name. She's in custody now." My breath caught. "Did she say why?" I asked. There was a pause, then a quiet sigh. "We'll need you to come in. She asked to see you." The idea of facing her filled me with dread. The woman who had walked through my door smiling, who had spoken to my husband in soft, reassuring tones, who had touched his arm as though she cared. That same woman had been slowly poisoning him. The betrayal felt too deep to articulate, and yet, some part of me knew I needed to go, not for justice, not for revenge, but for understanding. Because sometimes the only way to reclaim peace is to walk straight into the darkness that stole it from you. The police station was cold and smelled faintly of coffee and metal. They led me down a narrow hallway into a small interrogation room. She was already there, sitting at the table, her hands cuffed loosely in front of her. Delia looked different, thinner, her hair pulled back, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent light. But when she lifted her eyes to mine, there was something almost familiar in them. Not guilt, not defiance, but a weary kind of sorrow. "I never meant for it to go that far," she said quietly, before I could speak. Her voice trembled slightly. "At first, it was supposed to help." I felt my throat tighten. "Help?" The word came out brittle. "You call poisoning my husband help?" She flinched, tears welling in her eyes. "He was suffering," she whispered. "You both were. I saw it every week. The pain, the endlessness of it. I thought if I could ease it, just a little." Her words made the room spin. I wanted to scream, to accuse, to tear through the fragile calm she hid behind, but something in her tone stopped me. There was no madness there, only broken logic, the twisted compassion of someone who had lost her way long before she crossed my threshold. "He wasn't dying," I said, my voice shaking. "He was living. Every breath, every day, we fought for it. You had no right." She looked down, her shoulders trembling. "I know, and I'm sorry. When I realized what I'd done, how far it had gone, I wanted to stop. But then I saw the labs. I knew you'd notice eventually, so I found Lila." The name hit me like a pulse. "You knew her?" Delia nodded slowly. "She used to work with me. She's the one who found out what I'd been doing. She threatened to turn me in unless I stopped. I begged her to let me make it right, but she said she couldn't trust me, so she quit. I didn't think she'd ever come back." Her voice broke. "When she told you to check the labs, she saved him." For a long moment, there was silence between us. The hum of the overhead light filled the space where words should have been. I stared at her, searching her face for something human, something that could make sense of the senseless. And to my surprise, I found it. Regret. Genuine, unbearable regret. The detective ended the meeting soon after, his eyes avoiding mine as he guided me back through the hallway. I felt hollow, as though my body had been emptied of everything but echoes. The truth was out now. Justice would take its course. But closure, that was something no courtroom could give. When I returned to the hospital, my husband was awake. His eyes, foggy but aware, followed me as I entered. He tried to speak, but only a few garbled sounds emerged. I took his hand, pressing it against my cheek, and whispered everything. The investigation, the arrest, the truth behind the whisper. I don't know how much he understood, but when I finished, a single tear rolled down his face, and for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of the man I'd fallen in love with. In that moment, I realized something that would stay with me forever. Love is not defined by the years you spend caring for someone, but by the strength to keep believing in them, even when the world around you falls apart. The weeks that followed felt surreal. Reporters tried to call, news stations sent letters, but I refused every interview. This story wasn't meant for headlines. It was ours, painful, private, sacred. My only focus was his recovery. With the toxic drug finally out of his system, his body began to stabilize. The doctor said his organs had sustained damage, but that, with time and therapy, he might regain more strength. Hope, fragile and shimmering, returned like sunlight after a storm. Each day I sat with him during therapy, helping him relearn the simple things again: how to grip a spoon, how to form words, how to lift his head. Every small improvement felt like a miracle stitched from despair. The nurses encouraged me to rest, to take breaks, but I couldn't. Not yet. There was something almost sacred in the act of staying, of reclaiming those hours that had been stolen by deceit. One afternoon, while he napped in the hospital room bathed in winter light, I took out the letter from Lila again. I turned it over, noticing for the first time that there was something faintly embossed on the corner. A symbol, like a medical seal. I traced it with my finger, realizing it belonged to an old nursing association, one known for whistleblowing in medical negligence cases. It struck me then. Lila hadn't just been a random nurse. She had been watching, investigating, protecting. She had risked her safety to expose what others ignored. The realization filled me with gratitude so deep it almost hurt. Somewhere out there, she had chosen to disappear, not out of guilt, but perhaps to protect herself from the consequences of exposing something far bigger than my husband's case. I whispered a thank you to the empty room, hoping somehow it would reach her. Weeks turned into months. My husband grew stronger. The doctors were astonished at his resilience, his determination. He began to speak again, haltingly, but with growing confidence. The first time he managed to say my name clearly, tears streamed down my face. I hadn't realized how much I had missed the sound until that moment. It was like hearing a song I thought the world had forgotten. But recovery isn't just physical. It's spiritual, emotional, invisible. The house that had once been filled with machines and fear slowly transformed again into a home. I removed the sterile smell of antiseptic with candles and flowers. I replaced the hospital sheets with our old quilt, the one we had bought on our honeymoon. Every act, no matter how small, became a step toward reclaiming the life we had almost lost. Sometimes, late at night when he was asleep and the world was quiet, I would sit by the window and think about Delia. She was still in custody, awaiting trial. The detectives said her confession had uncovered other victims, other families like mine who had lived in ignorance, thinking their loved ones were simply succumbing to illness. It made me wonder how many whispers had gone unheard, how many lives could have been saved if someone, anyone, had simply listened. But alongside the sorrow, there was something else: forgiveness, not for her actions, but for myself, for not seeing it sooner, for doubting my instincts, for losing faith in my strength. I had carried guilt like a stone in my chest for years, but now I understood. Survival isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. It's about standing back up, even when the world tells you you're too broken to try. Months later, on a quiet spring afternoon that mirrored the one when this all began, we sat together in the garden. He was still frail, but he could hold my hand. And that was enough. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, painting everything gold. He turned his head toward me, his speech still slow but clear enough to say, "Thank you." I smiled through tears. "For what?" "For staying," he whispered. That was the moment I knew we had survived. Not just the poison, not just the stroke, but the slow erosion of hope. We had found our way back. Scarred, yes, but whole in a new, quiet way. And to everyone listening, watching, or reading this, if you take anything from our story, let it be this: never ignore your instincts. The world may call them irrational, but they are the echoes of truth we carry deep inside. And sometimes, a single whisper, one small warning, can save a life. If you've felt something stir in your heart through this story, if you've ever known the ache of loving someone through pain and uncertainty, then this moment is for you. Take a deep breath, hold on to the people you love, and remember, even in the darkest nights, there is always someone watching, someone whispering, someone choosing to do what's right. And before we move into the final part, the reflection, the peace, the ending that brought me back to myself, take a second now to subscribe if you haven't yet. Because the conclusion isn't just about survival, it's about the quiet miracle of beginning again. The day my husband came home from the hospital, the world seemed softer, as if everything, the air, the light, even time itself, had taken a deep breath and exhaled peace. I remember the way the wind rustled the trees, the faint scent of new grass mingling with the sweetness of blooming flowers, and the distant hum of the neighborhood waking from winter. After so many months surrounded by antiseptic walls, the world felt impossibly alive. The paramedics wheeled him up the ramp we had built years ago, and as I guided his chair through the front door, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet sense of return, not just to a place, but to life itself. The house, once filled with the hum of machines and the rhythm of medical routines, now felt different, warmer, lived in. I had spent weeks preparing for that day, scrubbing every corner, replacing every trace of the life we had been forced to live in survival mode. The faint smell of lavender candles filled the air, and sunlight spilled through the windows in golden ribbons, dancing across the floorboards. I had even framed one of our old wedding photos and placed it on the mantel, not as a reminder of the past, but as a symbol of the circle we had closed together. The woman in that picture, bright-eyed, unscarred, brimming with hope, no longer existed in quite the same form. But as I looked at her, I realized something beautiful. I didn't envy her anymore. I had become someone deeper, someone who understood the cost of love and the grace that follows pain. The first few weeks at home were slow, deliberate, and filled with small, sacred rituals. Every morning, I would help him sit by the window where the sun hit just right, and we would share breakfast, oatmeal for him, coffee for me, in the quiet companionship that no words could describe. He spoke more now, still softly, but enough for laughter to return in pieces. Sometimes he would say things that stopped me in my tracks, like fragments of clarity that surfaced between the fogs of his memory. One morning, as I helped him adjust his blanket, he looked at me and said, "You saved me." I wanted to tell him that he had saved me too, that caring for him, even through the darkest nights, had anchored me when I thought I would disappear, but I didn't. I just pressed my forehead against his hand and let the silence speak for both of us. The seasons shifted gently around us. Winter surrendered to spring, spring to summer, and each day seemed to bloom a little brighter than the last. With the passing months came the slow uncoiling of tension from my body, a release I hadn't known I was waiting for. I began to rediscover things I had forgotten I loved, tending to the garden, cooking elaborate meals just for the joy of it, even humming old songs while I cleaned. There was a peace in the ordinary now, a reverence for the mundane that comes only when you've nearly lost it all. Every so often, a letter would arrive from the detective assigned to our case, keeping me updated as Delia's trial progressed. I read them carefully, but without the bitterness I once felt. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only the ash of understanding. She had confessed to everything, not just in our case, but in others. She would serve her time. Justice, in its quiet, methodical way, had arrived. Yet I couldn't bring myself to hate her. Somewhere deep down, I believed that she too had once started from a place of care, warped by exhaustion, by pain, by the unbearable weight of witnessing too much suffering. The world can twist even the most compassionate hearts if they are left alone in the dark for too long. Sometimes, late at night, I still thought of Lila, her soft voice, the way she had looked at me that day with a mix of urgency and sorrow. I wondered where she had gone, whether she had found peace after all that had happened. In a quiet moment one afternoon, I wrote her a letter, not to send, but to release. I told her how my husband was healing, how I had found forgiveness in places I never thought possible, how her whisper had not only saved his life, but had saved me from disappearing into despair. Writing that letter felt like closing a door gently, knowing that behind it was a chapter that no longer needed to haunt me. Then, one morning, a package arrived. It was small, plain, unmarked, except for my name written in that same looping handwriting I had seen once before. My breath caught as I opened it. Inside was a simple card that read, "Keep believing in what you feel. It will always lead you home. L." I held it to my chest, tears streaming freely, because in that moment I knew she was still out there, still fighting the quiet battles that few ever see. There was something profoundly comforting in that, knowing that goodness doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it comes as a whisper. By autumn, my husband had made remarkable progress. He could walk short distances with a cane. His speech had improved, and he smiled often, real smiles, the kind that reached his eyes. One afternoon, as we sat in the garden surrounded by amber leaves, he told me that he remembered flashes of those lost years, moments of touch, of light, of my voice reading to him in the dark. "It felt like I was underwater," he said slowly, "and your voice was the only thing above the surface." That sentence broke something open in me, a quiet flood of emotion that washed away the last remnants of doubt I carried. For so long, I had wondered if all those years of care, of exhaustion, of endless devotion had even mattered, whether he had felt any of it through the haze of illness. And now I knew. Love, even when unseen, leaves a mark. In the evenings, we often sat together by the fire, the room bathed in the soft flicker of warmth. Sometimes we didn't speak at all. We didn't need to. The silence between us had transformed. Once heavy, now tender. It was filled with understanding, with the quiet gratitude of two souls who had been tested and had found their way back to one another. I used to think that healing meant returning to who we were before the pain, but I've learned that healing is about becoming someone new, someone softer, wiser, and infinitely stronger. Months passed, and life began to move forward in its gentle, inevitable rhythm. Friends who had long drifted away started to reappear, cautiously at first, bringing warmth back into our days. We hosted small dinners again, laughter echoing through the house that had once been defined by the sound of machines. Sometimes people would ask about our story, how we survived, how we forgave, how we learned to breathe again, and I would smile and say, "We listened to the whisper." That whisper had taught me more about faith than any sermon or book ever could. It taught me that intuition isn't just instinct. It's the voice of truth that speaks when reason is too afraid to. It taught me that love is not fragile, that it doesn't crumble under pressure, but bends, reshapes, endures. It taught me that even when you lose everything, safety, certainty, even your sense of self, there is always something left to rebuild from. One quiet night, as I tucked him into bed, he reached for my hand and said, "Do you think we'll ever be the same?" I looked at him, at the lines that had deepened on his face, at the kindness still shining through his eyes, and I said, "I hope not," because the people we had become, forged through fire, softened by pain, strengthened by survival, were more real, more whole than we had ever been before. Sometimes I walk outside in the early morning, when the world is still half asleep and the sky is painted in soft blues and pinks. I stand on the porch with a cup of coffee and let the wind brush against my face. There's a peace in those moments that words can't hold, a knowing that everything we went through had a purpose. The years of struggle, the betrayal, the fear, the whispers, they led us here, to this quiet, ordinary miracle, to this life we almost lost, now reclaimed. And as I stand there, I think about everyone who might hear this story. People fighting their own silent battles, caring for someone they love, wondering if it's enough. I want to tell them what I learned in those long, sleepless nights. That love is never wasted. That even the smallest act of care, the gentlest word, the quietest prayer, they all matter. They all leave echoes. Because healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in moments, in the warmth of sunlight through a window, in the sound of laughter after months of silence, in the whisper that reminds you to keep going. If you're still here with me, if you've walked through this story and felt something stir inside you, I want to thank you for listening, for feeling, for believing that even in the darkest stories there is light waiting to be found. And if you haven't yet, I invite you to like this video and subscribe, not for me, but for the stories still waiting to be told, the whispers still waiting to be heard. Because every story, no matter how painful, carries a seed of hope, and sometimes, all it takes is one person brave enough to listen for the whisper that saves a life.